Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. We're going to get into Sabaton History's Hearts of Iron. This is about, or it's for the Sabaton song of Hearts of Iron that we did a couple of days ago. And it's about the disobedience of orders and the corridor created for escaping Berlin. Okay, so that's the kind of general outline of what happened, but I'm interested to hear what they have to say about it. I don't know a ton about this, so let's go ahead and get into it.
I'm Indy Nidell.
I'm Per from Sabaton, and this is Sabaton History.
A German soldier defying Hitler's orders might sound dangerous to you, and it was, but for one man, it was necessary to save many lives.
And we were looking for a story where the Germans was not always the bad guys.
A story which I'm going to tell you right now, and then Per's going to tell you about the song. From the beginning of the Soviet Union's final World War II offensive towards Berlin on April 16, 1945, the situation on the Eastern Front had deteriorated rapidly for the Germans. By the 22nd, Soviet tank corps spearheads were already starting to surround Berlin from the north and the south. With the encirclement of Berlin soon at hand, German high command from the bunkers under the city center were calling for immediate assistance. The 12th Army, under General of the Panzertruppe Walther Wenck, had just retreated east of the Elbe at this point, fighting a losing battle against the American advance from the west. Now beyond the river, they could make a stand while providing a tactical reserve against that advance. But the Führer's orders changed their enemies. Now, Wenck's 12th was ordered to strike to the east, into the Soviet flanks, and to relieve Berlin. However, what was called an army, a corps, or even a detachment this late in the war was often nothing more than a mixed group of veterans, stragglers, wounded, and conscripted youngsters and middle-aged and even old men. Wenck's 12th had a large group of basically kids from the Hitler Youth, young men who hadn't finished school, and they were now tasked with taking on Russian tanks. According to General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel, they were to unite with additional Panzer Corps, tank corps, under General Felix Steiner to the north, while the trapped 9th Army would make a break to the west and join them. Together, they were to relieve the capital from the Soviets, who had over 1 million men advancing. It was a plan, at least, but one that only existed on paper. Wenck's army had only recently been reorganized with men from all branches that could still fight. That was the only requirement. But even this late in the war, the German army was still able and reliable, and they still had fight in them even in a futile battle. The army's diaries of this day read, "No deserters, no prisoners, no missing."
Who could ever have believed? Seems like nothing's been achieved. Just to walk a day, go all the way. The fronts are closing in as the end is drawing near. The 12th Army interfere. Open up a route, get people out. Its forces spread out there.
It's crazy to me how different the world could potentially be if the Nazis weren't so fanatical, right? Because their military ability and just kind of the good timing and overall, lightning offensives of the war were extremely successful in mainland Europe until they got to the Soviet Union. And so I wonder sometimes, like World War I Germany did not have that sort of fanaticism in it. How different could the world look today if World War II Germany was of the same ilk of World War I Germany? Right? Like, how different could everything be? Because I'm not sure, like, you look at a map from earlier in the war, all of Europe is under German control. you know, at this point of the war, they're barely holding on to Berlin. But for years, they have had almost all of Europe. And so it's kind of crazy to see how much territory they got. And then once they start to lose in the Soviet Union, how quickly they really lose all that territory. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. The Soviets could massively outproduce them. They had way more manpower. But also, and I've talked about this before, the Germans waste resources on things that are of their like political mindset. So like things that really don't have anything to do with the war, winning or losing the war, they waste a large amount of resources, you know, doing all of this stuff. And again, it's just, I wonder sometimes how different things could be. I feel like as bad as the Nazis were, it was almost better long term that they were so bad, because then there was no ability to negotiate or give quarter, right? Whereas if they didn't have that craziness in them, I just think the idea of making peace or coming to terms or something like that would have been, you know, maybe more available from the rest of the world that was fighting against the Germans.
The 12th Army was heading to Berlin. They had only a few vehicles and tanks, mostly mobile assault guns, and little fuel, so the men had to make the 150 kilometers to Berlin on foot. By the 25th, they had reached the outskirts of Berlin, but the situation had worsened dramatically. The Soviets were already south of Potsdam and east of Brandenburg an der Havel, west of Berlin. The surrounding of the capital was nearly complete, and the Soviet forces were much stronger than anticipated. While examining his maps, General Venk hesitated. Was relieving Berlin even possible at this point? In talks with Keitel, though, the orders from the bunkers under Berlin were clear. Get the Fuhrer out. His destiny is Germany's destiny. Only you, Venk, only you have the power to save Germany now. So Venk went to work. The only chance to relieve Berlin at this stage was to split his troops towards the north and south and relieve as many of the defending German forces around Berlin as possible so they could make up a small reserve for an attack towards Berlin itself. This would maybe destroy enough Soviet forces or just hold them back enough to give Berlin some breathing space and for civilian refugees to escape the city. But even that would only be temporary. But Keitel rejected this plan. Berlin itself had highest priority. A push toward the Fuhrer must be done immediately, and that's it. Well, Venk knew that this would quickly be the suicide of his army, and he realized that German high command had totally lost touch with the situation and the reality of the war. Steiner's tanks in the north were already being pushed back, and the 9th was fighting for its life. In this situation, Venk chose not to follow the direct orders from Adolf Hitler himself. Instead, he, quote, had to follow the guideline of his conscience. Saving Berlin.
Yeah, if only more high-ranking Germans could have done that during the war. Man, there are stories like this though. Like, I feel like we kind of have this idea that not the German civilian populace necessarily, but like the German officials in any regard were like die-hard fanatical Nazis. And that there were cases, I mean, there were cases of German officials that were actively working with the Allies. So there were cases of men that were Nazi officials or military officials that were not die-hard fanatical Nazis.
Was impossible. The only thing his army could maybe achieve was getting as many people away from the Soviet advance as possible. By attacking towards Potsdam, he would relieve the encircled garrison there. and by creating a corridor from there towards Berlin, they'd be able to let refugees flee the city. An attack to the south would give the Ninth Army a chance to join their lines. Wenck called this his Rettungswerk, pretty much his rescue mission. Only on this would he gamble the lives of his young soldiers. In the early morning hours of April 26, the final German offensive of the war began.
Who'll survive and who will die? Up to Kriegsglück to decide. Those who made it cross without a loss have reason to reflect. It is not about Berlin. It is not about the Reich. It's about the men who fought for them. What peace can they expect?
Elements of the 12th Army made their way northeast. The key to their advance was the infantry division Hutten, hardcore veterans who had just days before recaptured Wittenberg from the Soviets and held off overwhelming forces for days. Now they were the wedge that drove into the Soviet positions with artillery and tank hunters. The Soviets were totally caught off guard by the attack, and by midday, the 12th Army had advanced 18 kilometers toward the city of Bielitz. On Hutten's flank were the elite Scharnhorst Grenadiers, who pushed down the Autobahn through the night, throwing themselves against the tenacious Soviet defense. House-to-house fighting against superior heavy tanks was vicious and costly, and they often had to resort to close-range attacks with Panzerfausts, single-shot anti-tank guns. They went days without sleep or sufficient food, while the Soviets were constantly reinforced, but despite heavy casualties, they made progress towards Berlin. By May 1st, the 9th Army had managed to use the momentum of the 12th and break out of their encirclement. Spirits rose as the exhausted soldiers of the 9th and the hundreds of civilians with them joined the 12th. But seeing the ragged and wounded men limping into his ranks, Venk marveled at Hitler's insane plan to fight the Soviets head on. The 9th had been nearly destroyed just fighting for its survival and the survival of the many civilians in its midst. Other fighting forces were able to link up with Venk as well. And the same day, Hutten reached a large German military hospital near Potsdam. Once more, the fighting was brutal as they stormed the Soviet trenches, but for 24 hours, they were able to get many hundreds of wounded soldiers, nurses, and Red Cross personnel out before the Soviets could return. This was the very end of the European part of the war, and it is difficult to find and follow the reports from the last days of the fighting around Berlin. The Germans did not make many records. The Americans also often didn't record a lot of it, and the Soviet archives are still not fully available. Neither Steiner nor Venk reached Berlin, though, and Hitler chose suicide over capture in his bunker.
It's the end of the war. Reach for endless joy.
On May the 2nd, Venk's army retreated. It would protect the refugees and bring them across the Elbe and into American custody, day and night.
I just found out just the other day that the U.S. spent millions of dollars looking for Adolf Hitler after the war. I had never, ever heard that before. I had always assumed that everybody because it's taught today as like factual information. Hitler, Eva Braun, they killed themselves in the bunker. The Soviets find them. Like that's taught today as like the historical fact. So I guess I just always assumed that it was the case at the time, that it was just taken as historical fact. And I found out the other day the U.S. spent millions of dollars. The British were looking for him too, post-war, in South America and North Africa, at least in those two places, which is just really bizarre to me. Really bizarre that the U.S. was openly saying, like, he's for sure dead, he for sure killed himself in the bunker, and at the same time, they're signing off on all of these manhunts to go look into if he's in, Argentina or wherever. It's just, I don't know, it was just a bizarre thing to read.
They marched, avoiding contact with the enemy from the east as long as possible. Soviet pursuit, though, was initially weak, as they were concentrating on taking Berlin. On the 3rd, Venk made contact with American General William Simpson of the 102nd U.S. Infantry Division of the 9th U.S. Army near Tangermunde. Now, the Allies had agreed among themselves that either the German army would capitulate as a whole, or that small groups could capitulate to them individually via their commanding officers. But there was a hitch. This partial capitulation could only happen to the opponent they're actually engaged with, which for Venk was the Soviets. To surrender to the Americans, Venk technically would have to attack them and then surrender. Well, the Americans simply kept silent in regard to the surrender proposal. They did not fire on the advancing Germans either, in violation of the Allied contract. Still, General Simpson let the wounded cross the river, but only with just enough medical supplies for them. Same with Venk's soldiers and their personal provisions, but he would not allow civilians to cross. Men were even sent out with whips on the partially collapsed bridge to hold back civilians trying to cross with the soldiers. It could have been more of a human tragedy were it not for sudden Soviet fire that rocked the remnants of the bridge. This killed several American soldiers, so a 2-kilometer retreat from the river was ordered. This allowed civilians to cross the river. Venk's army soon had to fight the Soviets, though, who had renewed their attacks once they realized what was going on. With each break in the lines, Venk had to order young men to their deaths to recapture and hold positions for just an hour or two so that others could live. It was a final act of self-sacrifice in a war that was essentially over. As the last German grenades were shot, the last artillery pieces and the last tanks were blown up, and then the last German soldiers, among them General Walther Wenck himself, crossed the river and entered American captivity. In the end, thousands of soldiers, civilians, nurses, women, children, and the elderly were saved from the fall of Berlin. As an end note here, on the 8th of May, as the very end came, many men and women attached to the 9th Army were extradited back to the Soviets. To this day, we don't know the exact reasons for that, though we do know that there were several suicides to escape that fate.
See the city burn on the other side, going down in flames as two worlds collide. Who can now look back with a sense of pride? On the other shore, there's the end of the war.
Now, you said that this song was inspired by a video game. Can you dig into that a
yeah,
little?
there's a game called Hearts of Iron.
Right.
So, and we have a song called Hearts of Iron, so there's obviously a connection there.
Right.
So, many years ago, when we had a concert in Stockholm, we were approached at an after party by people from this Swedish development studio of games called Paradox.
Right.
And some of the guys came and they said that they were big fans of us and they really appreciate the work that we are doing with writing music about history. And we started to talk about that we are doing pretty much the same thing. I mean, they are doing games about history and we are doing music about it. They asked us, is there any way that you can like write a song that would be like a lead theme for our game that is coming? And we said, okay. And when we were researching, we came across the story about Walther Wenck, and it took a while to keep discussing and developing the idea.
I have talked about this before, but the creators of all different types of stuff, games, archives, music, the use of kind of like different content creators to advertise, I feel like is a, like I am so in full support of that. I feel like that's an awesome way to go about it. If you're creating a game that is about tanks or ships or whatever, reaching out to a content creator, obviously they don't have to be as big as Sabaton, but reaching out to a content creator for anything and having them do like a whatever kind of history they do, have them do one for you, like on their thing. I feel like that's just such a good way to go about advertising. And it's a way that people can actually learn and not, and not just see like an ad roll down the side of their thing or whatever. You know, like it's a way for people to actually engage with the information that is the background of the game or song or whatever.
We did other things connected to this, and inside of Hearts of Iron, there is released now soundtrack of Sabaton. So it was possible to get the music, our songs, when you play the game. It's pretty funny actually today, but a lot of our fans in China discovered Sabaton through the game Hearts of Iron. When we speak sometimes with developers of games, they often talk about how important music is inside of that.
game, sure.
And it's pretty funny because for a lot of people today, music is not important anymore. I mean, you see the whole industry of music taking a big tough hit, and people are not as willing to pay for music as they used to be.
Well, there you have it, Hearts of Iron 4 featuring Sabaton music, and that was all for today with Hearts of Iron.
On Sabaton History Channel. All right, thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to the Sabaton History Channel, check out Indie's other channels, and support us on Patreon, because that's what makes this happen.
Okay, so that was the Sabaton history for Hearts of Iron. Yeah, really, really cool story. The end of the war is just such a bizarre time in history. You know, you have the Allies technically working with the Soviets, but they don't really like each other. You have the Germans who do not want to be taken or surrender to the Soviets. It's just it's a clash of a lot of things, but really cool story. I will get into the next video on the flu pandemic later today or tomorrow. I had the day off yesterday, basically because I had family come in that I didn't know was going to be here. But I'll start getting the videos back out, you know, as quickly as I can. So, as always, like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here. Sorry about my voice. Again, I've just been under the weather, so I sound kind of crazy. But I'll put the link to the Discord down below, and I will see you all next time.